Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Greetings. Welcome to the Arihanta Institute Podcast. I will be your host for this episode. We have a different revolving host every different episode, and this time I get to be it. And for those of you who do not know me, I am Dr. Cogen Bohanec. I'm an assistant professor in Sanskrit and Jain studies at the venerable Arihanta Institute and I'm also a visiting assistant professor at Claremont School of Theology. We've got a really great program with us today. One of my favorite scholars in Jain studies here is Dr. Anil Mundra. Now, Anil Mundra, for those of you who don't know him, he's an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies and the holder of the Bhagvan Vimalnath Endowed Chair in Jain Studies and South Asian Religions at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He completed his PhD at the University of Chicago in 2022, and after that he held the Alaka Siddhartha Dalal postdoctoral fellowship for the study of Jainism at the Department of Religion at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. His research examines how religious diversity is confronted and navigated in classical Jain philosophy, especially the concept of Anekānta-vāda, which is what we're going to talk about a lot here, the theory of non-absolutism or non-one-sidedness. His dissertations focused on the writings that are attributed to the Śvetāmbara polymath, Haribhadrasūri, which is another topic of interest that we'll get into in this episode. Some of his recent work has brought out the research to bear on questions of religious pluralism, religious comparison, toleration, universalism. All of these are going to be great points of conversation that are of much interest to Jain studies scholars and to the world in general. So I'd like to welcome you today, Anil. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to see you, Cogen.
Yeah, great to see you too. I should also note that I've known Anil for many years now. As a graduate student, I worked on the contemplative studies in Jainism volume. And Anil had one of my favorite chapters that I hope we can talk about a little bit today in that book about the nature of bhakti and Haribhadrasūri's writings, as well as just the nature and the role of bhakti in Jain religion in general. So let's start with that first issue here, and that is the Haribhadrasūri. Like, your work really focuses on him, and you described him very nicely as a polymath, which he really is. And you also had a little clause there in your bio about the works attributed to him. So let's open it up a little bit. Let's say something about who Haribhadrasūri is, or who the Haribhadrasūris are. And what is your fascination with Haribhadrasūri? Like, how did you get into this particular thinker, and why do you focus so much on him? And I guess we can talk a little bit about his influence in Jain philosophy in general. So yeah, how do you think about Haribhadrasūri?
Yeah, sure. Well, Haribhadrasūri is just this like super important, influential figure that looms really large in the Jain tradition, or particularly for Śvetāmbaras, particularly in Śvetāmbara Jain tradition. He looms so large that it's hard to really say much about him and who he really was. And so I mean, sometimes I, talk about the Haribhadra corpus, because there's this, the corpus attributed to him, this range of works attributed to him just span this incredibly broad swath of genres and concerns, story literature, philosophical literature, monastic guidelines, what I call doxographical literature, where he's surveying the works of other philosophical schools, yoga manuals, as you are very familiar with, and maybe the thing that he's best known for, and in some ways most influential for, although it's hard to pick the site of his greatest influence. But one of the things is these commentaries on the Śvetāmbara āgamas. He really was sort of the first one to really undertake a program of Sanskrit commentaries on the Prakrit scriptures. And so he really sort of brought, the scholastic discourse of Jainism into this multi-religious sphere of conversation in medieval India in the lingua franca of Sanskrit. So partly because of is exactly this, this fact of him having so many works attributed to him, it becomes a little hard to say whether all of these are in fact by the same person. So there are authorship problems, and there are various theories swirling about two Haribhadras, maybe more Haribhadras. I mean, the name Haribhadra itself is used by a few different people over the course of Jain history. But the sort of central works that are attributed to him, there are, again, questions about whether these are all by the same person. And I really, I just don't think we have enough information to make a solid determination about that. And I think authorship problems are often very, very difficult in South Asian intellectual history. Dating problems are also difficult. So the question of the authorship and the dating of his works, those are distinct questions, but obviously very related. They're difficult questions, and I try to avoid them as much as possible. And I don't have like a sort of a really strong opinion on this. And I don't think I need to, because in the end, what I'm really interested in is, there's this figure and there's this corpus that's just really important in Śvetāmbara Jain philosophy, and also in Jain philosophy and Jain thought generally, beyond, not only Śvetāmbara. So it's almost like, it's almost called, Haribhadra, it can be just the name for sort of this general discourse, that doesn't have to be by a single person. There are some reasons, for some purposes, why you might want to know whether there's a single person that authored any given set of works. But for the most part, I am willing to bracket those questions and just say, here's this set of works that has been received as, as sort of a corpus, as a unified corpus in the tradition, and has deeply informed the tradition. And what does this say about sort of Jain thought generally? And so that's also partly why I can spend my lifetime working on Haribhadrasūri and nothing but Haribhadrasūri and never be done. And to me, that would not be a sort of a one-trick pony kind of thing. That would not be a one note just working on one person, because it is this really massive, sprawling corpus that I think represents really, in some ways, a whole tradition. Now, that's not to say that all of Śvetāmbara tradition or all of Jain tradition is reducible to this, not at all. And I think part of what's really important for me and for some of my colleagues is bringing out the diversity within Jain tradition and Jain intellectual history, that there different thinkers do treat, the similar issues in different ways, and also often treat different issues. But this is one stream, I think, that has been really big and really important. And so that's what drew me to it, because I thought, especially his work on Anekānta-vāda, which has been super important, needed to be better understood. And so I got into him to answer the second part of your question. How did I find Haribhadrasūri and get into him? I started from a place of being really interested in issues of religious diversity and disagreement and pluralism and some of those things that you mentioned in your introduction of me. And Haribhadrasūri seems to have also been these, some of the works that are attributed to Haribhadrasūri, and a number of them are very, very interested in issues of religious diversity. He is one of the most intensively, in a time period in which a lot of intellectuals were becoming very intensively engaged with others who, differed from them, who belong to different schools, different streams of thought, different religions. He's one of really the most intensively engaged. And he has, some works that are just all about the sort of diversity of schools of thought. And then he also has some works that are about Anekānta-vāda. And it's become a sort of a commonplace that those two wings of work, those two projects, the Anekānta-vāda and the sort of, we could say the broadly doxographical, or these looking into, addressing different schools of thought and the diversity of thought, that these two sort of hang together as a single whole, obviously, but it's actually not so obvious when you look at his corpus. So part of really what I was trying to do in my doctoral dissertation, and which will become a book before too long, is think about what in Haribhadra, what does the engagement and examination of religious and intellectual and doctrinal diversity have to do with this particularly Jain theory of Anekānta-vāda. Again, as I say, to many people, it seems straightforward and obvious that these two hang together in some way, and I don't think it is so obvious. And so I tried to really look carefully at how this works. And so this is a broader question than not just about Haribhadrasūri, but what does religious diversity have to do with this theory of non-one-sidedness, Anekānta-vāda? So that's been my central driving research question to date.
Yeah, wow. So a lot in there to unpack, and I suspect that that's what we're going to spend the rest of the podcast unpacking everything you just said there. But yeah, it's really interesting. I have a lot of the similar interest in Haribhadrasūri, the corpus. I mean, talk about like diversity. I was speaking with somebody recently who said that there's like he gave me the specific number that Śvetāmbara Jains attribute to him, something like 1,000 and something texts.
Yeah, the traditional number is 1,400. And then sometimes, but it's not, there's not just that. Sometimes it says 1,440, sometimes 1,444. So you see different numbers in different places, and there's debate about whether that means 14 and change, 1,400 and change, like independent works, books. Does that mean, 1,400 and change sort of chapters, or essays that some of which might belong together in a single work? Like he has a number of works that have sort of a lot of chapters that are addressing different things. So I mean, it's really hard to know what to do with these numbers. We don't have anything close to that number that are extant to us, that are actually attributed to him and extant to us, or even that are mentioned by people that are, enumerated and listed. We have maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 that are, that we can sort of name and list, and we don't even have all of those in full manuscript form, let alone published. So but the point is just that, yes, there's this massive, even if it's 100, as you and I know, to publish 100 works in a lifetime is a pretty tall order. So he was clearly, if he was a single person, he was clearly a prolific one, and maybe sort of superhumanly prolific, who knows. And in any case, this is a very large and very wide-ranging corpus.
And then there's different, like you often hear that there's two Haribhadras, like the Vira who's like 550 of the Common Era versus Yakiniputra, it's like 700 of the Common Era. And that a lot of that was kind of unearthed in the early part of the 20th century when they saw that his relationship to Dignaga probably put him at a later date. And, so a lot of that has happened. I really like what you said. I think you and I are a lot alike. I consider myself as a scholar in philosophy of religion. And that's as opposed to like a historical critical scholars. And that's a different brand of scholarship where they really are interested in the dating of ideas and the relationship is the unfolding of ideas. I'm like a little bit more interested in the ideas themselves. And I think you and I kind of have a lot in common in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And there's also something to be said about Haribhadrasūri as being a seminal thinker. And I think that that's one of the things that makes him so interesting. And you've talked about like his Anekānta-vāda. You also mentioned the shift towards Sanskrit and how he was really seminal in that sort of shift into Sanskrit discourse. And then also I might add to that yoga and contemplative practices, like his work in that regard, his sort of co-opting of the sort of broader sort of heuristic structures and yoga thought in sort of forming them into traditional orthodoxy, Jain orthodoxy, Tattvartha Sutra kind of stuff. I think he was kind of a seminal thinker in that. So I wonder if you might want to say a couple things about like the importance of the shift to Sanskrit amongst the Jain tradition and how Haribhadra was important in that way. And then also maybe something about how important his other sort of seminal contributions in terms of what he did for yoga in Jainism, and then his seminal contributions to Anekānta-vāda. If you might want to say something about him as a seminal thinker there, I'd love to hear it.
So yeah, the shift to the use of Sanskrit it has everything to do, I think, with exactly these issues of engaging in religious diversity and this kind of, we could say, a sort of, becoming cosmopolitan, engaging in a cosmopolitan discourse, or at least, a Jambudvipa-politan, let's say, in the cosmopolitan meaning, the whole world is your city. And we can use that in a sort of a loose sense here. But of course, they're thinking of, in particular, this sort of, this particular landscape of the South Asian subcontinent, which they very often called Jambudvipa at that time, the island of the Rose Apple continent, right? And whereas for a long time, the discourses of the different religious, what we could call the different religions, and of course, bearing in mind that this notion of religion and different religions is this is an English word with a Western and very largely Christian genealogy. So this is a sort of a contemporary Western analytical construct, religions, but so it may or may not fit very nicely onto pre-modern South Asia. But let's just call it heuristically different religions, and at the most heuristically, various kinds of what we now call Hindus and Buddhists and Jains. These various religions were very largely siloed discursively for a long time. We have, at least a millennium of textual production in which, or roughly a millennium of textual production in which these, Sanskrit was very largely the province of what we now call, and there certainly this conceals a lot of diversity within Hinduism, but what we now call Hinduism and, Brahminical, sort of in, Vedic and post-Vedic thinkers, that was largely Sanskrit. They were using Sanskrit. Buddhists were largely using Pali, and then started to adopt Sanskrit by the beginning of the Common Era. But Jains really kept in almost exclusively in Prakrit and various dialects of Prakrit until early centuries of the Common Era, or maybe even depending on how we date some of these texts. How we date the Tattvartha Sutra, how we date Śvetāmbara's Aptamimamsa, for example. Really stayed in Prakrits until the sort of maybe the middle of the first millennium of the Common Era. And so there was this kind of, discursive insulation whereby Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains were they were certainly aware of each other, and they were interacting with each other, and they were talking about each other to some extent, but not engaging very robustly in dialogue or debate, and not talking about each other necessarily in very great detail. And it's really, it's really when they start writing in Sanskrit, when Buddhists and Jains in particular start writing in Sanskrit, that they start to be able to really engage people outside of their own fold. And so Haribhadra's not the first person to do this. As I said, probably the earliest Jain texts that we have that I can think of in Sanskrit are the Tattvartha Sutra and Śvetāmbara's Aptamimamsa, unless I'm forgetting something, and apologize to my scholarly peers and to everyone if I'm leaving something out there. But in terms of sort of philosophy and doctrine, those are the earliest ones that I can think of, probably the earliest ones. And then Haribhadra comes along a bit later, for sure, probably a couple centuries later after these. But still, when Haribhadra comes along, Sanskrit hasn't taken hold super strongly yet. There have been other Sanskrit writings in the meanwhile, but especially, as I said, the sort of the commentaries on the Jain scriptures has continued to be in Prakrit, and the fact that he wants to start writing these Sanskrit commentaries on these Prakrit scriptures is really tells you something about how he's really trying to enter this sort of cosmopolitan, pan-Indian, cross-religious, interreligious discourse. And he's also at the same time in other works, right, and also in his commentaries, he's entering this discourse in deeper ways than just using the sort of this lingua franca of Sanskrit. He's really engaging in some of the concepts, some of the shared concepts that become available in this lingua franca of Sanskrit. And so one of the big things is that, one of the big things that happens once Buddhists start seriously engaging in Sanskrit discourse is the development of non-sectarian epistemologies, let's say, or less sectarian epistemologies, rules for debate and knowledge formation that are by which people in different that have disagreements across sectarian lines can talk about things and argue about things and try to show why they're right and the other guy's wrong, and try to find truth in a way that doesn't just simply appeal to, let's say, their canonical scriptures or whatever it is, the words of their founder, with whom your opponent doesn't subscribe to, right? So you finding common ways, shared ways of navigating this kind of shared discourse, and that develops particularly in Buddhist logic and epistemology in the first half of the first millennium of the Common Era. And then Jains come into that too. And Haribhadra is one of the key figures that brings Jains into that discourse. And he writes a commentary on this Buddhist logic, which, to my knowledge, that's one of the very few instances of someone from one tradition who is clearly, whose allegiances are with one tradition, writing a complete commentary on a text that is clearly identified with another with another religion, let's say, another tradition. That happens very rarely in the pre-modern history of at least Sanskrit intellectual history. So there are a few examples maybe of those, but this is one of a few. So this is, I'm thinking of Haribhadra writes this commentary on a primer of sort of a handbook of debate and logic that is attributed to sometimes attributed in some traditions to the Buddhist logician you mentioned, Dignaga. And then similarly, there are these yoga works that you also mentioned. So that brings me to the second thing that you were talking about. And until then, until this time of Haribhadra or the Haribhadras, this sort of middle of the first millennium of the Common Era, you've had works on yoga like by Patanjali, for example, and others. And for Jains, first of all, the particular Jain vocabulary I would say, and I haven't done a careful study on this, but I would say the word yoga until this time for Jains does not usually mean what people like Patanjali are talking about when they say yoga. For Jains until this time, it seems to me to usually mean the joining, that is the binding between the soul and karma. And so it's a bad thing. It's not what you want. It's the thing that what the rest of the people call yoga is supposed to counteract. So Haribhadra enters into this discourse, and until this point, there have not been, to my knowledge, there hasn't been much dedicated writing on yogic practices. That is, these ascetic what we would call the ascetic practices that come under the heading that we would call yoga, the kind of thing that's recognizable as yoga, like in Patanjali's yoga. There hasn't been a lot of Jain writing on that. Haribhadra comes in and sort of initiates this tradition of using yoga in this sense in which others are using it, and giving instructions for yoga like the ones that others are giving, and in fact bringing his instructions, which are different from Patanjali's yoga and other people's yoga, but sort of synthesizing, drawing lines of correspondence and correlation between his system and other systems of yoga. And so again, there's this entry into this sort of multi-religious or multi-traditional debate, discourse, and bringing the Jains into that and making them participants in the conversation.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. It's so nice. I think that even though you didn't actually go into history per se, I could really feel the historical context of Haribhadra, even if we don't know exactly how many there were or when the dates were.
Yeah.
But you can really sort of feel a lot of the changes of the Gupta Empire, for example, is often described as the golden age of Sanskrit literature in particular, and how this moving away from what you referred to as religions being siloed to this much greater sort of interfaith engagement, and Sanskrit becoming a vehicle for that. I think that's a really nice counter narrative to another narrative that we get a lot in South Asian studies about the Sanskritization as being a force of hegemony and submission, where people have to submit to Brahminical norms. And Sanskrit has used that. And I'm not saying that's like doesn't happen, but we can also look on the other side of that. Actually, in some ways, it was a way of an equalizing agent, a way of pulling people out of their silos and giving norms to debate, as you mentioned, and creating this interfaith engagement. So that's
of course, and it doesn't, and of course, it's not an either or. It's probably a both and. There's the usual thing with hegemony. It's people who are sort of subalterns in sort of the broadest sense. People who are marginalized by a certain hegemony enter that hegemony, sort of capitulate in some ways or whatever. Adopt some of the norms of that hegemony in order to claim their own power, in order to make their own space within it, in order to resist it and subvert it sometimes. So it's both of those things are certainly at play, I think.
Yeah, and then I think the interesting turn in this conversation is going to be obviously the yoga turn, but that's part of a broader sort of thing, like how it is that Anekānta-vāda becomes sort of employed by Haribhadra in service of this sort of movement against siloed religions, to more cosmopolitanism, towards more interfaith acceptance, And I think that, I would like to ask you about the significance of how Haribhadrasūri kind of uses, you would also mention, and this is a very interesting sort of, again, a counterpoint, where you said he has all this doxographical corpus, right? Where he engages and he articulates the doctrines of other traditions in so much depth that even today, sometimes Hindus will look back to Haribhadrasūri to understand what other schools believe, because he did such a good job doing that. But he's got these doxographical corpus, as you referred to, and he's got Anekānta-vāda. And I believe that your wording was that they don't necessarily hang together in the way we might think. So I guess my question is this movement towards cosmopolitanism, how does Haribhadrasūri sort of frame Anekānta-vāda in service of that? And how does it work how is it that it might not hang together with the doxographical corpus? Let's pull on that a little.
Sure. Well, and before getting to that, I just wanted to, you said this thing about that even, today Hindus sort of look back to Haribhadrasūri sometimes and for sort of this doxographical work. And just an interesting tidbit, this notion of what's become a trope of like the six darshanas, the 6 schools of thought. And this is now sort of gotten ossified into the 6 Hindu schools of thought. So they're often, this is very, very commonly cited in terms of Hindu thought as 6 sub-schools of Hindu thought, as opposed to Jain and Buddhist thought or others. So, I won't bother listing them, but the Haribhadrasūri, as to my knowledge, and as far as I think anyone knows, is the first one to have talked about these six schools of thought as a group of 6, but it wasn't these ones. It's not the same ones as the 6 Hindu schools. So it's interesting, he has Jains and Buddhists on the inside of the 6 schools, whereas the 6 schools of Hindu thought that are commonly appealed to these days don't include Jains and Buddhists. So anyway, but this is one example of, I think, the far-reaching influence of Haribhadra, even beyond Jainism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's like he comes up with this Shad-darshana, this 6 school system, as a means to be inclusive, and then it kind of gets co-opted to turn into this like Astika-Nastika polemic, which of course Jains reject. They're not Nastikas, they're not atheists or whatever you want to translate.
Well, and just to pursue this a little further, yes, and in fact that's built into Haribhadra's Shad-darshana analysis also, this Astika versus Nastika thing. And it's just the Jains are on the inside. They are Astikas according to his lights and according to pretty much all Jain philosophers in the history of Jain philosophy, as far as I know, but not according to some other non-Jains. They're considered Nastikas, deniers. So Haribhadra is definitely very much trying to sort of make a place, to borrow a phrase from, or an adaptive phrase from the late Anmonius, make a place for Jainism, imagine a place for Jainism within this larger discursive sphere, within which, it's not clear how much he really succeeds, because in the sense that, although I do think Jains and Jain thinkers have been very important and influential in the sort of general history of Indian philosophy and South Asian intellectual history, they usually still get ignored. They, up until this point, other thinkers, non-Jain thinkers, don't generally tend to cite or engage them very much in their literature. And then after Haribhadra, also they continue. I mean, I think basically for most of pre-modernity and even arguably in modernity, Jain thought largely gets sort of ignored, at least in an explicit way. And so that's not to say that there might not be much more sort of tacit and implicit, subtle influence that Jains have had, arguably. So anyway, but that's Haribhadra. It really does seem to be trying really hard to bring Jainism into this larger discourse with others. And Anekānta-vāda is certainly one way in which he does that. I mentioned it's not the only way in which he does that. I mentioned these other ways, logic and yoga, but Anekānta-vāda is certainly one of the ways in which he does that. And it allows him to Anekānta-vāda is, of course, it seems to be, and I'll talk a little bit, I should say, because we don't know if everyone who's listening knows what Anekānta-vāda is.
Yeah, maybe we should introduce the topic.
The term about, and in fact, this is exactly part of what I'm trying to sort of work against, is this sort of like assumption that we know what Anekānta-vāda is. So I'll say, but the usual thing, and so the usual thing, the assumption about Anekānta-vāda, and particularly in this sort of doxographical, let's say, frame of this thinking about the diversity of religions and schools of thought, is like, okay, you look at there's all these different schools of thought. They all have these different views of things. They all have these would seem to be mutually opposing views, and you look at that and you say, well, what's going on? They can't all be right. Who's right? And then Anekānta-vāda comes in and says, well, actually, they're all right. And they're all right in their own ways, in their own respective particular ways. Because Anekānta-vāda is the philosophy of non-one-sidedness. It means that there are many sides to truth. There's not just one of these is not the whole truth. Of course, the famous image that is very commonly used and has been used by Jains for many centuries is the blind man and the elephant, and the various blind men are saying that the elephant is, they each compare it, they each describe it as something different. They can't all be right, but it turns out it's actually the elephant is all of these things there. And the way this is usually put is that they're all right in their own ways, and everyone is right from their own perspective, is the way this is often put, that everyone is right for their own perspective. And this is supposed to be sort of some lead to some sort of religious pluralism or tolerance or universalism, everyone's right, no one's wrong kind of thing. And that's where it becomes very problematic quickly, because for logical and conceptual reasons, I mean, this just immediately gets us into the usual problems of kind of contradiction and self-referential paradox that just happen with any form of relativism, where you say everyone is right from their own perspective. Everyone has the truth according to their own perspective. That easily you immediately get into problems of subjectivism and paradox, and that there's no truth at all. And I don't think that's what's happening in Anekānta-vāda at all. I'm quite sure that that's not what Haribhadra was driving at, to just to say that everyone is right in their own way. He's trying to. I mean, he's very clear about Anekānta-vāda is supposed to get us at the truth, and he uses it to intervene in these debates between all of these different parties, all these different doctrines and schools of thought that seem to be, interminable, and there seems to be a lot of talking past each other. And it often seems like, how can you begin to adjudicate, between, let's say, these two blind men who can't, who are just looking at different parts of the elephant and can't see the whole. He wants to intervene and say the way reality really is it's more complex than all of you are making it. It's multi-sided, it's multifaceted. None of these simplistic, one-sided, sort of flattening descriptions of reality can actually capture reality in all of its complexity. So, this is not first of all, this has nothing to do with with subjectivism. This has nothing to do with sort of, everyone's true and by their own lights kind of thing. It's very much focused on the objective truth and objective reality, and it is taking a stand on what objective reality is really like. But it's saying the only way you can really make sense of the way the way reality really objectively is by taking into account these various aspects of it, these various complex interlocking sides of it, where you have to understand how something that is true in one aspect, that is right about reality in one aspect, is not true about reality in another aspect, that the opposite is true in another aspect, and that in order to have a full description or at least a fuller description, or at least an adequate description of any object of reality in a way that doesn't get you into all kinds of puzzles and confusions and mistakes, you have to take into account these various sides, these various ways of approaching it. So maybe I'll pause there for any further follow-ups, but that's to begin to give you sort of my basic take on what Anekānta-vāda is, what it's about, and where a lot of the sort of common glosses on it go off the rails.
Yeah, wonderful conversation here. This obviously is one of my favorite topics because I feel like I'm always saying till I'm blue in the face that Anekānta-vāda is not relativism. It's not accepting contradictions. It's accepting that seem in contradictions. We could look at square of opposition.
Yeah.
That's a little bit separate. But I think that you as an educator and me as an educator, I think we might have a common experience to like what Alan Bloom wrote about, I think it was 1989 or something, when he wrote The Closing of the American Mind, and how when he tries to ask college students about truth, they would say, whose truth? As if truth was like a matter of personal opinion and there is no such thing as objective truth. And I think that becomes particularly poignant around religion because all of us are sick to death of religious hostility. And most people, relativism is, I think, something that we all want. Like we all want everybody to be equally right at the same time and in the same way, because that makes you the good guy in the room. You're right. You're also right. You are also right. Like Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, and I think that we want to be the nice guy in the room who just like, you're right. Like Oprah giving away cars, and I find that with religion in particular, that people really don't want to accept that one religion must be more right than another. They can't all be equally right at the same time. So I guess what I would spell out for our listeners is just like, what is relativism? It's the claim that truth claims are all right at the same time and in the same way. And that is accepting contradictions. That means that both A and non-A can be both right at the same time and in the same way. And that's really not what Anekānta-vāda is doing.
Right. No, totally. And let me refine it a little bit, because I think what you've just articulated is a consequence of relativism as it's usually understood. And the consequence that you've just articulated is that the law of non-contradiction does not hold, that contradictions are true. And so people do sometimes say that about Anekānta-vāda, which I think is exactly wrong. And Haribhadrasūri is very clear about, and in fact, and not just Haribhadrasūri, every Jain philosopher they're always getting accused by their opponents of endorsing contradictions, virodha in Sanskrit, and they always all say, no, there's no contradiction. We are not into contradictions. And so it's, as you say, it's about showing that two things that on the face of them are apparently contradictory can be reconciled in some way. You can show that they're not actually contradictory, and it is by relativizing them. But here's why it's not relativism. Because relativism, I think as it's usually understood, is that truth is relative to the observer, let's say. Truth is relative to the one, to each particular thinker, right? To each subject that is thinking about the truth. And every person who has some view of the truth, whether that is actually true is relative to each of them, that there is not a universal truth. There's not some objective truth apart from the subject who is taking themselves to behold the truth. That is not, I just don't see I just don't see anything like that in Anekānta-vāda, anything quite like that. What you see in Anekānta-vāda, and it can, we can see why people might interpret that way when you look at how Anekānta-vāda actually works. It's not that truth is relative to the observer. It's that the facts about an object, that is, the claims that you can truly make of an object, are relative to the aspect of the object that you are focusing on at any given moment. And so it's not that truth is relative. It's not relativism in the sense that it is sort of subject relative. It is relativism in the sense that it's object relative, or more specifically, object aspectual relative. It's relative to some given aspect of the object that determines what you can truly say about an object. But that's because the object really is a certain way, and it is a lot of certain ways. And then you can see why people think this has to do with the subject, because, if you think about it sort of spatially, you're looking at something from one side, it looks a certain way. You look at it from another side, it looks a certain way. So you can understand, this does have ramifications for observers and subjects, but it's not primarily about subjects, and it's not about each subject's truth. It's about the truth of the object, the actual, complete, real, full, ultimate truth about that thing. And that is about all things, about reality, the universe generally. And the point is to come to a full and complete, or at least more complete, at least more adequate description of things that doesn't land you in sort of ridiculous statements about things that actually can't possibly do justice to the way the world manifestly works.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that calling relativism ridiculous is important. And let me just spell that out for our readers or our listeners who may not have taken Logic 101. The problem with relativism is that if it is true, then it's also false.
Yeah.
It would be both true and false. So, for example, if I say that all religions everybody's point of view is equally correct, and then you say your point of view is not at all correct, then I have to say, yes, you are also correct, which means that my position is both correct and not correct at the same time in the same way. So it just logically cannot work. And I think that when people with their sort of like good-natured impulses want to just accept the truth of everything, they haven't thought it through clearly that it is an actual real contradiction. And this is why I like to use like relativity rather than relativism. It's hard to make that distinction sometimes, but I think and I think that relativity also brings the sort of metaphysical ground of Anekānta-vāda with Nyaya-vāda, right? That everything is defined in relationship of everything else. So, for example, to know this thing completely, I would have to know it from the perspective of everything else in the universe. And that's the only way that I can know this thing. And that sounds very much like Einsteinian relativity, as Padma famously pointed out.
Yeah, maybe. And if I could just also, because you invoked Alan Bloom, and actually this is very apropos insofar as, we're at a moment right now of, sort of culture war about education and purported indoctrination and diversity and so on. And that's Alan Bloom was intervening in this 40, 50 years ago or whatever, or 60 or whatever it was, in a way that today very much echoes, and where a lot of the sort of Alan Bloom sort of 2.0 or 3.0 folks today are taking aim at similar kind of boogeymen of relativism. So in some ways this conversation about relativism is at the center, I think, of our sort of national, even though it's not usually, it's not always named in these terms, in terms of relativism, but it is sometimes, at the center of sort of the national conversation and culture war about education and everything else, frankly, and DEI and everything. I think Bloom was right to sort of reject relativism for exactly the reasons that you're pointing out. But the problem is that the alternative, and which I do think Bloom sort of was susceptible to, and I think the reactionaries against the sort of postmodern relativism, are also susceptible to now, is taking a sort of a flattening, one-sided view of the things in the world, because, some particular aspect of them is sort of the one that is most conspicuous or dominant or popular or whatever it is, that's what needs to be totalized and enforced as kind of doing full justice to really doing right by the way reality is, the way things really are. And that's exactly what Anekānta-vāda rejects. You cannot flatten and enforce one particular side of the way things are as standing in for doing full justice to everything.
Yeah, and I think that's really what the word āgamas is, because let's not forget that Anekānta-vāda is a critique against the Anekānta-vādas. I think we may also bring in, again, the metaphysics of this as well, too. A lot of this goes back to Tattvartha Sutra 521, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, where it says that all things have to have three properties. They have to arise, they have to sustain, and they have to disappear, which means that reality is ultimately like a dynamic flux. And what he did, a lot of what the early Anekānta-vāda was critiquing was metaphysical systems that allowed for things to arise, but not to sustain or disappear, or things that sustain, but then don't, like absolute monism, but doesn't arise and doesn't disappear, or things that only disappear, like Buddhist Kshanika-vāda, but then they don't arise and they don't sustain. And so the early articulations are like, well, look, all things must have these three things. If you're stating a metaphysical system that upholds one of these principles at the expense of the other, it's āgamas, it's absoluting, it's diminishing other aspects of the reality by overstating one aspect of reality. And I wonder if that is what's happening to some degree in our political system and our political discourse. We take one sort of thing like, it's not good to discriminate against people based on race, and then people kind of inflate it in one side or the other. There's a hyper sort of left way of inflating that, and then there's a hyper right way of inflating that. And both sides of this kind of have their own version of Anekānta-vāda, the same way like Buddhist Kshanika-vāda might lean on no sustaining, versus absolute monism, a still dynamic singular reality, might lean too heavy on that. I think that we're not getting something like that in our political climate. And so
totally. And it's really, so this is, as you pointed out, I mean, this is arguably the central problem that Anekānta-vāda has very largely been geared towards, is what seems to be a sort of, what sometimes we might call a paradox of change. How can things change, but then also still be the same? How can a thing change, but then also still be the same thing that it was before? But this is not a paradox. And what I think exactly what Jain philosophers point out is that this is just common sense. It's not a paradox that things change and yet remain the same. It's patently obvious that anything that you're looking at is very frequently changing, and yet that there is some basic continuity within it. And so they're just trying to, systematically be able to articulate how that can be the case. And yeah, I mean, in fact, this itself seems to me very applicable to contemporary political debates and the question of change, the question of progress and conservatism. And, and it's interesting that, this is one of the things that I have said in I have worked in my research to really insist that Anekānta-vāda is a philosophy of common sense. And that, I think, is important because it sounds complicated, and a lot of the things that we're talking about here might sound a little bit, highfalutin and abstract and complicated. And certainly a lot of their opponents, Jain's opponents, philosophical opponents in, traditional Sanskrit texts, viewed it as sort of very abstruse and weird and complicated, and often accused them of contradiction, as I mentioned. And but Jains are certainly, Haribhadra is very, very insistent on this point, and you find this in a lot of Jain philosophers, that they really insist this is common sense. This is just common sense, folks. So I've written about that in a number of places, that it's supposed to be a philosophy of common sense. And now suddenly I find that the term common sense has, in the past week or two, been taken up very strongly by certain political factions. And it worries me a little bit. And I'm like, whoa, this seems a little bit problematic. And certainly there are plenty of intellectuals who are very critical of the idea of common sense. And because very often common sense can just be a way to encode and enforce prejudices, right? And widespread prejudices. But again, I think this is where actually Haribhadra's Anekānta-vāda is again very useful, because it's not that it's the point is to see take something like this so-called paradox of change, and I think part of the common sense that is being certain political factions are really trying to insist on right now is that America is a certain particular thing, that sort of needs to be retained, and that's a very, dare I say, that's a kind of a very one-sided view of anything, because everything is always changing. And so it's actually not commonsensical when you really, it's common sense in a certain, it's like, it's a very I would say that it's not common sense. It's a simplistic flattening. To just take a one side of things. You could see how some people might mistake it for common sense because it's simple and it's sort of easy, but it very quickly runs into problems where you can't make sense of very basic aspects of the history of anything. So I really want to say that what Haribhadra and Anekānta-vādis are doing, it is a philosophy of common sense, but it's a philosophy of critical common sense. I like to call it, critical common sense or common sense criticism. It is a critical philosophy of common sense complexity. If at the risk of having too many C's in there, that the common sense approach is not to see things as simplistic or just one way or the other. That in fact, the complexity of things is itself commonsensically obvious, and that actually gives us that recognition gives you the resources by which to criticize flattening, wrong-headed, totalizing views of things.
Wow, so much in there, Anil. Thank you for that. So we're flying really close to Hegel here when we start talking about being and becoming and the paradox of change. The idea that I was the same person I am yesterday and I'm not the same person I am yesterday is a seeming contradiction. But actually, in some ways, I'm the same person as I was yesterday. In other ways, I was not. And so therefore, I both was the same and was not the same as I was yesterday at different times and in different ways. That's the basics of like a kind of formal approach to dialectic. And this is why we see with Śvetāmbara, with the Sattabhangi, is being a trans-rational dialectic, where it really has the seeming contradictions posited by side, and then acknowledges the limitation of language altogether. And then also, so what would happen is that ability to synthesize seeming contradictions as being both truths at the same time and in different ways is the hallmark of Anekānta-vāda and the hallmark of dialectic logic. And then if you think that they're mutually exclusive, that it must be one or the other, and you have a illicit disjunction, a false binary.
Yes, exactly.
Then what happens is when the other schools accuse Jains of contradiction, and Jains respond with, no, not contradiction, dialectic. What they're basically saying is that your Viroda accusation of contradiction comes from your own illicit disjunction. You have created a polarity and a dynamic where one
false dichotomy. Exactly. And so I think that's exactly one way to think about what Anekānta-vāda is all about in its sort of critical aspect, is criticizing false dichotomies and refusing false dichotomies. And in fact, just because this is an engaged Jainism podcast, I have been thinking, and I'm very concerned. I'm very interested in thinking about how to apply this, beyond scholastic logic, right, and apply this to sort of contemporary issues. But yeah, no, I think you see this, and I've heard some public figures and policy makers whom I prefer to some other ones, and who I think are thinking about things in a better way, often saying this kind of thing, that what you're saying, that this kind of thing, the choice that you're trying to make people make is a false choice, a false dichotomy, and that there's no reason that you can't have it both ways. Now, there might be in some situations, there might be some things that you can have both ways, but the trick is, and what Anekānta-vāda actually helps you to navigate, I think, is to figure out the ways in which you can have it both ways. You figure out the ways in which the one thing is applicable and the ways in which the opposite, is applicable. So construct a more nuanced and complex solution to problems. And so yes, I mean, I think you're right to think about Hegel, at the risk of losing everyone because Hegel's so hard to understand. But I have also compared Anekānta-vāda to Hegel in some way. But I think it's also, I personally think that Anekānta-vāda sort of does better than Hegel in certain ways. And there have been a lot of, there are a lot of critiques of Hegel, of course, in contemporary and postmodern philosophy for being sort of totalizing the dialectic as being totalizing and sort of absolutist in its own way. And after all, Hegel basically considered his position, I don't know if it was his term, but he, certainly was interested in the absolute and called it absolute idealism. And where I think just to mention briefly, where I think Anekānta-vāda is similar to and different from Hegel and sort of does better than Hegel is that, for Hegel, there's this sort of processual aspect where the synthesis sort of subsumes everything, and you have the polarities. So you have, any one side entails its opposite. Sure, and that's very Anekānta-vāda, that there's, whenever you posit one side of something, you have to also recognize its complementary opposite. One side entails and implies its complementary opposite. I actually think a yin-yang is actually a pretty, this not all the ways that yin-yang actually is used and conceived of in Taoism, but the symbol of, the iconography of the yin-yang is a pretty nice way to visualize this, the negative and positive, mutually conditioning, mutually complementary, not mutually exclusive in the sense of the one has to be banished. They are mutually exclusive in the sense that they are opposites, but not that the one of them is the only thing that there is, right? So far, so good in Hegel. Where I think Hegel goes beyond that is then the synthesis comes and sort of subsumes or sublates the two opposites in sort of some higher unity. And that doesn't really happen in Anekānta-vāda. And I think that's actually very useful and very helpful, because there is a unity in the sense that, the two sides of anything or the multiple sides of anything are in a single thing. If we're looking at a single object and there's just one world, we live in a single world, so that it's, unified in that sense. But the opposites are preserved in Anekānta-vāda, and so I think that's also important to think about, if we're looking at this as a way of navigating diversity and navigating sort of opposing poles, opposing positions. It's not that we want to efface or, sublate or subsume, difference. It's the difference is preserved, and the preservation of difference is intrinsic to understanding both poles of the difference. That, all differences require sort of the two poles, and seeing something in its wholeness requires seeing that difference, not losing it, not subsuming it or, dissolving it.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. Yeah, I know this all gets very cerebral, so I want to move on before we get too deep. But I would note that what you say, I think, is exactly right. The sort of Hegelian grand synthesis leads into more of a monism, where the Jains resist that grand synthesis and allow for more of a pluralism. And this is what Padmarajaya refers to Hegel's dialectic is a conjunctive synthesis versus Anekānta-vāda is a disjunctive synthesis, because it doesn't have that and allows for more difference, a stronger element of difference. Yeah, that all gets very cerebral, but we're coming to the end of our time here. But I do want to ask you, we've touched on it a little bit, how Anekānta-vāda applies to daily life. And you really mentioned sort of the fear of demographic change, that people are afraid of diversity, change in demographics, where white males are smaller part of the population. They don't have as much power and hegemony. And it seems like there's almost a false binary. And Anekānta being posited by sort of like the right wing in particular, where it's either there's change and we're erased, or there's no change and we're not erased. So therefore, let's not change at all. They don't realize that like actually you can have unity within diversity. And so that's one place I think you really poignantly pointed out how Anekānta-vāda can sort of help us embrace the changing demographics of our society and not become so intransigent. But also we don't want to just like completely eradicate anybody either, you know? But are there other ways that you can see Anekānta-vāda being relevant to some of the major issues today, and like, you know, how it can help us in resolving conflicts, and how does it help in common ground? And it's often called like a form of intellectual ahimsa, and how much validity do you have in that? So let's close the podcast with that thought of like, what can Anekānta-vāda do for us today, Anil?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I do think that you know, for in the ways that I've mentioned, I think that Anekānta-vāda can be, you know, very well applicable, and I think the basic thing is, you know, in giving us resources to see how, you know, things are more complicated, but not necessarily, you know, in a sort of a scary or unmanageable way, you know, but that things are more nuanced than they're often presented to be. And so solutions, you know, the solutions that address problems, you know, need to be multifaceted and complex also. So very often public, you know, contemporary problems are framed in terms of two opposing sides. And of course, that's, you know, I mean, there are political and probably social psychological reasons for that, you know, and we live in a two-party country in the U.S. Anyway. And so you have these, you know, this sort of polarization, you know, where everything sort of gets framed in terms of two polar opposites, and you have to pick one or the other. You know, are you pro-Israel or pro-Palestine? Are you pro-choice or pro-life? Or, you know, and I would rather not wade into any. These are obviously very hot button issues, and I don't have the answers to any of them. But what I will say is that I can say with great confidence that the issues themselves are much more complex and multi-sided than these simple binaries present them as, and that the solutions will have to be much more complex and multi-sided than choosing one of those or the other, you know, than you know, and I think in any of these false dichotomies, choosing one to the total exclusion of the other pretty reliably lands us in basically a self-defeating, highly destructive kind of position. So that's, I would say it's sort of, you know, in general, and I don't want to get into the nitty gritty because I think that the nitty gritty of any particular issue really depends on the details of the issue, of the thing itself, looking at the thing itself and the different aspects of it. And that is for people who are experts in the things themselves, you know, political scientists and, you know, whatever it is, you know, people who know the issues. But I think that's the general advice, is just a shift of mindset that, you know, these wildly I think it's really, really relevant to the moment we're living in, because we have ended up in such a wildly and kind of ludicrously, ridiculously polarized discourse, right? Where the range of positions is just so flattened. I mean, it's like you have, you know, something either really, really far out on one side or something really, really far out on the other side, and the two can't talk to each other at all. And in order to find common ground, I think what we need to be able to do is recognize how each of them, you know, what each of them are recognizing, what aspect of reality each of them are getting onto, and single that out and really disentangle that from the whole flattened package that is on either side, you know, and say, okay, if we want to accomplish this on this side and we want to accomplish this on this side, how can we do so? How can we find a solution that does both and I think it's very often difficult, right? That's not going to be easy in most cases, but I think there are very few cases in which it would be completely impossible.
Yeah. Okay. That's really great. Yeah. I mean, it is a time where we need to be able to, it's the age of the binary right now.
Right. Exactly.
The public to be able to nuance and to be able to think across boundaries and try to find value in other sides, you know, because that absolute totality It's a good way to create a lot more hostility and conflict than what's really necessary. Well, thank you, Anil. I want to ask you one last thing, and this is if the readers want to know more about this and your work. I know that you have this amazing dissertation on pretty much everything we were just talking about there, and in my understanding is that you're going to have that as an upcoming book. Do you want to say something about that? Or?
Well, there's not much to say yet, so just stay tuned. So I do have articles forthcoming in 2 volumes. One on the notion of pluralism, religious pluralism, in a volume that's called Provincializing Pluralism: Difference and Diversity in South Asian Traditions. So I'm talking there about the ways in which Jain philosophy can be and should not be understood as, some kind of religious pluralism, and Anekānta-vāda is part of that. And then I have another similar paper in a volume called Toleration in Comparative Perspective, coming out from the University of California Press, talking about, also nuancing the ways in which, because Anekānta-vāda has often been presented as religious pluralism, religious toleration, and I talk about, the reasons that it has been presented that way and the ways that tends toward misinterpretation. Then you also mentioned the thing about intellectual ahimsa, which is in there in the toleration article a little bit. I mentioned it a little bit, but I haven't done a lot of work on that. And has been famous critical work on this in the last few decades, but I have to put in a plug for my colleague here, my colleague Jinesh Sheth, who has recently finished his dissertation at the University of Mumbai. And that dissertation, which he is also turning into a book and is also, not imminently coming out, but he has, I think, done some of the best work that I've seen on the relationship between Anekānta-vāda and ahimsa. And, I think we can just say that these two, Anekānta-vāda and ahimsa, are both centrally important in Jain thought, undeniably, but the relationship between them is, again, not so obvious, and we all have a lot to learn. We can take a lot of guidance from both of these principles, from both Anekānta-vāda and ahimsa, and Jains certainly take a lot of inspiration from them, but it's not necessarily that one is like reducible to the other. Yeah, so there's a few things to look out for.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, as I said before, you're one of my favorite thinkers in Jain studies. I really enjoy and appreciate your work. I particularly appreciate your philosophical approach to Jain studies, which to me is, that's in my heart. So thank you very much, Anil Mundra, for joining us and for such an enlightening conversation here on our Arihanta Institute podcast.
Thank you so much, Cogen. It's great to be with you all. Keep up the great work.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.